The golden light reflected on Indy's face is what Steven Spielberg calls God light, and we can look at it as the same light that tells Indy which Holy Grail is the true one in Last Crusade, and the same light from the Ark that punishes evil and Indy knows to look away from. That wise reference to the power of light is all right here in this opening scene. And I don't know if you ever got this, but this golden idol's eyes move. I'm not joking. It's one of hundreds of awesome details worked into Raiders by Spielberg that I'm going to explore in this deep dive. I'm Erik Voss, and let's dive into Raiders of the Lost Ark. As we analyze Indiana Jones movies this month, the best way to support this endeavor of appreciating the buried layers of meaning in great films is to get an Indy I Love You shirt at nerdriot.shop. The film opens by cross-dissolving from the Paramount logo to a peak in the jungles of Peru in 1936. All Indiana Jones movies opens by transitioning this way. It's something Steven Spielberg used to do in the movies he made as a kid. This is actually Kalalea Mountain on Kauai. Steven Spielberg, George Lucas, and Philip Kaufman conceived of the Indiana Jones character as a throwback to the adventure B-movie serials that they grew up watching. These films aren't really profound attempts at Oscar glory. They're great filmmakers using all of their best tricks to get the most out of a familiar genre trope, and they end up creating one of the best movie trilogies of all time. And part of the greatness of Indiana Jones is the sense that we're just dropping in on an already established adventurer on one of his many exploits. Raiders takes place in 1936, but technically Temple of Doom is a prequel set in 1935. And a sign of this movie's timelessness, I believe, is how even the 10th or 12th billed actors end up going on to do great things. In this opening scene, Alfred Molina, future Doc Ock in the Spider-Man film, several other great roles, plays Indy's guide Satipo. His other guide gets spooked. Yes, the reaction's a bit over the top, but it shows the power of superstition in this world. Indy begins his film thinking he's immune to such supernatural forces. He's a smug jerk. He puts fortune and glory over all else. It's why we love him. But this journey in Raiders is a lesson that we all must learn. When to turn away, when to let go, and when to kneel before God. And when given the chance to turn away here, Indy keeps going, past light streaming in through the trees, making even this jungle look like a cave. This is something Spielberg does a lot. He just washes his frames with natural light. From a purely technical standpoint, so that we can see everything, but in this movie a symbolic undercurrent priming the hero with too much light, blinding him so that he knows exactly when to look away. But in this scene, Spielberg withholds showing us Indy's face. George Lucas and Larry Kasdan knew from Darth Vader that a great cinematic character is always just recognizable from his silhouette alone. And behold, a masterclass in editing and storyboarding here. Yeah, that was 9 shots in 5 seconds. The guide pulls the gun. Indy cocks his head hearing it. The gun rises. Close up on the whip as Indy turns. Indy rears back the whip. Then just 6 frames of the whip crack, as you'll notice, Satipo flinches from this sound. Then a quick wide shot of the full action. Then the guide recoils, grabbing his hand. Then a close up of the gun falling in the water. We heard a gunshot there, but only because the gun goes off when it hits the rock. The whip beats the gun. It's faster. And now, only now, is Indy's face revealed. It's classic Hollywood rule. Introduce the hero doing something cool before you show their face. So when they go in the cave, Indy gives Satipo a torch, but Indy doesn't carry one himself as he leads the way, because he is adjusting his eyes to spot where the light booby trap is. Indy swipes tarantulas off his back. Satipo has one on his shoulder, but he turns around to reveal a whole bunch of them. This is a kind of visual trick Spielberg loves to use. I call it a scale reveal. Like you begin with a shot of a solitary curiosity to set up, wow, a vast quantity of them. Spielberg does this with the poison darts, like just starting with one in the tree, then a dozen in the back of the guide, the shot of Indy running over the hill alone, followed by dozens of Ovitos, and then later one basket with Marion, followed by a dozen baskets. Indy warns,
stay out of the light.
Yes, the power of light. The ancients who built this tomb somehow were able to rig a motion sensor triggered by pressure or heat or whatever it is, light weaponized in a way to make us appreciate mystic forces. Avoid the light is a lesson Indy will have to teach himself in this movie. The entrance to the idol chamber is marked by this golden sunburst. This was a MacGuffin from the 1954 Charlton Heston film The Secret of the Incas, which inspired the Indy character in this Peruvian location. They reach the idol chamber, and Indy steps into the light so we see his face. Now, observers have called this the Spielberg face, when a character reacts in awe and astonishment in the face of the unexplainable. While it's not always necessary to the action of a scene, Spielberg proved as a filmmaker that giving your characters a beat to just mirror the awe of the audience watching helps us psychologically connect to the action. Now, as Indy approaches the idol, there is one shot that you can see this movie dozens of times and still miss. This idol's eyes move. It watches Indy hop back and forth. And it's not just the light shifting. They actually built this with a mechanism that would move its eyes, but they ended up not using it in too many of the close-ups. Now, reportedly, the effect is invisible, but I did find this one shot where it still is. This idol truly has divine power. Indy empties some sand from the bag, explaining why he was scooping sand in a bag earlier, because he's trying to guess the idol's weight to do the shift. So as he's looking at it, he's wondering, is it all gold or is it just plated in gold? It's sort of the same eyeball test that he'll later apply to the possible Holy Grails. The real one was wooden but plated with gold leaf in the inside. Spielberg frames the idol behind the sand running through Indy's fingers, showing how all of these treasures inevitably slip through Indy's fingers, including we will see the Ark. John Williams' amazing music in this movie scores this scene with insane tension, going from loud to quiet. Guess we go from a scream to holding a breath. So everything collapses, and Satipo tricks Indy, fleeing with the idol. I like how Spielberg edits right before Satipo reaches the light booby trap in the background. Indy's able to slide through the door with whip crack. Then boulder! Great blocking detail, the little stumble Harrison Ford does with the boulder right behind him, just enough to make our hearts skip a beat. He rolls out of the temple and runs into Belloc. Belloc raises the idol to the superstitious Jovitos, kneeling before God that Indy exploits to escape. He shows here that he knows how powerful these relics can be to true believers. Belloc doesn't fully appreciate it. So as Indy sprints over the hill, I love that they covered Harrison Ford in dust just for this shot to show him shaking off the temple dust. Makes him look like a mummy himself, like the joke Belloc later says, preceding him sealing Indy in a tomb.
Who knows? In 1,000 years, even you may be worth something.
John Williams mixes in the very first leitmotif of the Indiana Jones March on the Tarzan swing. Now, a couple Lucasfilm Easter eggs here. OBCPO is the number code of the plane for Obi-Wan Kenobi and C-3PO, and the plane engine sound effect is a common Star Wars engine shutting down or starting up sound effect. And capping all of this, the only thing to really frighten Indy is the pilot snake Reggie.
I hate snakes, Doc! I hate them! Come on, show a little backbone, will ya?
The perfect punchline to end the most badass introduction to a film hero. Indy's heroics will never be fully appreciated by the world he returns to, that is, except the smitten girls in his college class. The juices are actually flowing everywhere in this campus. Even Marcus Brody, who turns his head to check out a co-ed, telling us that part of his esteem for Dr. Jones is the admiration he receives from the women in his class. The girl with "love you" on her eyelids had to walk around all day like that. Now, there's an important line in the lecture as Marcus walks in.
Confuse that with robbing, in which case we mean the removal of the contents of the barrel.
Yeah, it's easy to miss, but it shows that Indy doesn't consider himself a grave robber. He doesn't want to open the containers he finds and plunder the treasure. He just loves the containers themselves and the history associated and the pride of uncovering it. Telling us that Indy probably wouldn't have opened the Ark of the Covenant. He just loves the Ark itself and is one-upped by Renee Belloc in this movie into beating his rival to that treasure. Dr. Jones lectures on the dangers of folklore and how it leads to the degradation of archaeological sites and cutthroat treasure hunts. An important lesson, but also folklore will also be what saves Indy in the final act as he goes from skeptic to believer. Another detail often missed, this final male student who lingers behind to leave a no-look apple for teacher. Yeah, it's not just women. All of Indy's students love him. Now, throughout this film, you'll notice examples of the Spielberg oneer, in which Spielberg does these long takes, but not to call attention to himself, like a lot of modern films do now. He just does these subtle shots for theatrical reasons, to let scenes play out in real time, let the actors act and inhabit the space, and then create new visual compositions created by the blocking of the camera movement. Like Jones and Marcus in the classroom is a 1-minute take, followed immediately by a 30-second take of them greeting the government men in the lecture hall and getting situated. But the shot is not static. The actors are in constant motion to create dynamism within the shot. And I love this scene as an example of status. Indy comes into this worried that he's in trouble with the government, but by setting the scene in a lecture hall, a haven of academia, Indy telling the agents to have a seat, it all goes down on Indy's turf. He stands, they sit. Think about it. Typically in movies, the government agents arrive to brief the hero, but here they ask Indy to explain to them, and the professor teaches them about the Ark. So by doing this, Spielberg allows us to see Indiana Jones as a true expert in the subject. And you remember the previous shot, Indy's arms were full of these goofy rolled maps. Now we see Marcus has taken the maps from him and Indy just has one book, a massive ancient book. An insanely awesome movie prop. Like, look at it, it has a f***ing buckle. This gives Indy more authority.
Obtainer of rare antiquities.
Slam! Hell yeah, he's an obtainer! Now this scene is filled with exposition, but Larry Kasdan smartly scripts it so naturalistically so that characters interrupt each other.
You see, over the last 2 years, the Nazis have had teams of archaeologists running around the world.
Well, the city of Tanis is one of the possible resting places of the Lost Ark.
Everyone is contributing to the conversation, and Spielberg shoots us on a variety of angles so we don't really get bored. And also the acting's just great. Major Eaton is William Hootkins, who also plays Porkins in Star Wars and Lieutenant Eckhart in Tim Burton's Batman. What a career! And he's so good in this scene.
You guys ever go to Sunday school?
Well,
Oh, look. Hebrews took the broken pieces and put them in the Ark when they settled in Canaan.
Yeah, he goes from outrage to being judged, to annoyance with his fellow agent, to grumpily submitting, to Indy, in this case, being the top man. Marcus goes on.
In a secret chamber called the Well of Souls.
Secret chamber.
However, about a year after the...
On the word secret chamber, notice how Eaton's eyes shift over to Indy, trying to pick up on whether these academics might have been approached by the Nazis. Indy chalks a diagram of the staff of Ra in the headpiece, demonstrating the power of light. But also in this lecture hall, Spielberg lights Harrison Ford to cast this hard shadow on the blackboard. Indy is turning away from the light to signal his uncertainty about facing the light of the supernatural. But then Indy cracks open his big old book to show a depiction of the Ark.
Now, what's that supposed to be coming out of there?
Lightning, fire, power of God or something.
Yes, Indy respects the power of light. He just doesn't yet recognize its divinity. From the headpiece beam to this diagram, this opening scene foreshadows the two key mystical moments in Act 2 and then in Act 3 as a way of saying, pay attention during school, kids, this shit is real. Another great but missable Spielberg wonder, nearly the entire scene with Marcus and Indy's house is done in one take. 1 minute, 45 seconds this time. We go from the men at the door to toasting, to Indy packing, to then Indy remembering Marion.
So she'll still be with him?
Possibly. Marion's the least of your worries right now, believe me, Indy.
Yes, we hear a leitmotif of Marion's theme from John Williams, and then from here, Spielberg pushes in on Marcus.
For nearly 3,000 years, man has been searching for the Lost Ark. No one knows its secrets.
Yes, Marcus, the teller of ghost stories in these opening minutes. Indy breaks us out of this moment by crossing the frame, but this is the first of 3 definitions we're given about the Ark before we actually see it in this movie. The next one comes from Salah.
Death has always surrounded it. It is not of this earth.
And then from Belloc.
It's a transmitter. It's a radio for speaking to God.
Spielberg shows us Indy's globetrotting with iconic superimpositions of the plane over the world map, San Francisco to the Philippines to Nepal. The Nazi that spies on him behind the November 30th, 1936 issue of Life magazine actually isn't tote actor Ronald Lacey, it's legendary VFX artist Dennis Murin. We get another 90-second long take, another all-time best character introduction, Marion Ravenwood. She's in a drinking game. Here, Spielberg demonstrates what I call the 3-point shot. He shifts the camera back and forth across 3 points of focus. First, Marion's competitor, then shift down to the shot glasses between them, then back up to Marion. 1, 2, 3. We see this camera movement again during the fight.
Whiskey.
But during the drinking game, Marion fakes nearly passing out to throw off her rival. She spends this entire scene at least 12 shots in. This also establishes her high alcohol tolerance and her ability to fake blackout drunk, which she uses on Belloc later. Indy's looming shadow greets her, and while Marion starts in this shot smaller than Indy's shadow on the wall behind her, she steps closer to camera and looms larger than the shadow, signaling she's not the little girl he left behind. But she's still pissed.
I learned to hate you in the last 10 years.
I never meant to hurt you.
I was a child. I was in love. It was wrong and you knew it.
So Indy was Abner Ravenwood's grad student. Marion was 15 when Indy hooked up with her. I mean, hey, I guess it's a different time. Still messed up, as Marion says, the movie's aware of it. But really, the whole point of this moment is to characterize Indy as a driven sociopath.
Trust me. You know the piece I mean?
Oof, this guy! Indy's shifting attitude toward Marion is the most important part of his character growth in this movie. Without Marion, Raiders of the Lost Ark would never be the classic it is. It would still be a really well-made film, but I don't know if we would rewatch it as much. When Marion ogles the headpiece, a gust of wind disturbs the candle flame, a warning from above not to take this path. But Indy has infected Marion with his aspirations of fortune and glory. The Nazi Major Todt arrives, his voice shivering because he didn't know he'd need to dress for Nepalese temperatures. The steam from the snow on his jacket turns into the smoke of the fire poker, framed perfectly under Marion's face. Todt's face also drips with sweat, foreshadowing his own face-melting fate. But when Indy whips the poker out of his hand, you do see Indy's shadow on the back wall, lassoing the poker away. It's also the shadow of the Tommy gun Nazi that Indy sees steering his next shot. So much of the scene is really shot with characters in the foreground and the shadows of their enemies on the wall behind them. And since 12 shots wasn't enough, and there's no sense of wasting booze, Marion takes a beat to drink the leaking alcohol. I think my favorite character beat in this movie. Now, this big Sherpa who gets shot in the head is Pat Roach, the English pro wrestler and actor who plays the airplane mechanic that Indy fights later in the movie, as well as the chief thuggy guard in Temple of Doom and a Gestapo agent in Last Crusade. On to Cairo, where they meet with Salah, Jonathan Rhys-Davies, future Gimli from Lord of the Rings. There are no weak links in this cast. The Capuchin monkey was already there at the house when they arrived, suggested the kids were given this monkey by the Eye Patch Man before Indy got there. Eye Patch, by the way, played by Vic Taliban, who also played the other Peruvian guide who got plugged with the poison darts. Now notice when they go out on town, the monkey reaches for Indy's snacks, which Indy later reveals are...
It's a date. You eat them.
Dates! This monkey's date craving is what later saves Indy from being poisoned. Now the eye patch guy brings the monkey to the Nazis and he salutes, followed by this insane gag. Think about it, some boy taught a monkey to sing Heil. Apparently they did this by holding a grape above his head just out of frame to get him to reach up, but my favorite part about it is the Nazi returns a salute to the monkey. Just a little jab that all these guys were trained animals, monkey see, monkey do. Now during this fight, Spielberg just works in some great comedy. One swordsman stabs the other in front of the fruit stand, and when we cut to the other side, we see that the guy's now part of a fruit kebab. The iconic moment of Indy facing the swordsman, played by the stuntman Terry Richards, who trained for weeks for an extended fight scene, but Indy just shoots him. Now the story goes that Harrison Ford was suffering from dysentery, and that's why they cut the fight. And although it was reported that many in the cast and crew got dysentery while shooting, this misdirection was actually planned. Spielberg realized on the day that Indy wouldn't waste time with a sword fight if he was in a hurry to find Marion. So it wasn't because Harrison Ford was shitting himself, it's because Spielberg decided to prioritize the character and the character's wants. And that's what makes this so iconic. Indy's just a guy figuring this out as he goes. Now, as you can tell, we have been spending this summer talking about summer movies. My favorite kind of summer movie is one that takes you far away to interesting global locations. It's just something about summer that makes it the perfect time to travel. And if you want to get the most out of your trip, you're going to want to use Babbel to learn a language before you go anywhere. Babbel is one of the top language learning apps in the world. It's scientifically proven to help you start speaking a new language in just 3 weeks. Babbel's lessons are designed by real language teachers. Your subscription even comes with 2 free live classes. Babbel's method is simple. It teaches you real-world conversations so you're prepared to have practical conversations about travel, business, relationships, and more. Even if you just want to let people know, estoy aprendiendo español, por favor habla despacio. A Babbel subscription might be what you need. You don't want to be caught leaving a tomb with a golden idol, and then your archaeologist rival just gets a leg up by knowing the language of the locals. Hey, and if you're really in love with the language, get a lifetime subscription. If you're just flirting with a foreign tongue, there are monthly options available as well. No matter what you need, Babbel has you covered. Click the link in the description below, please, to get 60% off your Babbel subscription today. What a deal! After this amusing shell game with Marion in the basket, she gets loaded into a truck with an insane amount of ammo and explosives. I always wondered when the switch happens with Marion. Was it back in the bazaar? I don't think so. There's this little moment with Indy is pinned behind a wall and the beggars distract him. And behind him in the background, you can see a few people running out from behind the truck. I think it was here when the switch happened and they tried to trick Indy into thinking Marion was in this truck to misdirect him. But Indy shoots the truck, it rolls over and explodes. And think about it, the first time you saw this movie, you straight up thinking the love interest is dead here. It's a critical step in Indy's character growth. He briefly mourns Marion, but all it takes is really a chat with Belloc and he's over it. He's back on the hunt. So this character still needs to learn when to turn away. Indy tells Belloc,
"You want to talk to God? Let's go see him together."
By the end of this movie, they will. Salah's friend translates the headpiece, including an additional measurement direction on the back.
And take back one kadam to honor the Hebrew god whose ark this is.
So the Nazis only used the staff height from the front side of the medallion, the side that got burned into Tote's hand. They did not subtract a unit to honor the Hebrew god whose ark this is. Big mistake, not honoring that guy. The map room has a board with all these holes, exactly 365 of them if you count, to mark the days of the year in which to place the staff, depending on what day of the year it is. Also worth noting, the Egyptians also used a 365-day calendar. Indy locates the hole Belloc used, and then goes 2 down, since the Nazis would have been there 2 days earlier and the sunlight has changed since then. And by properly measuring to pay respect to the Hebrew god, Indy harnesses the power of light to locate the correct position of the Well of Souls. And a little detail I love, when Belloc leads the Nazi officers through the site, Salah passes right between them and they don't notice, because their insistence on employing every worker in Cairo to keep up with the Führer's timeline has created a crowd big enough for Salah and Indy to slip through. They open the Well of Souls, and since the Ark of the Covenant is presented in this movie as a kind of Pandora's box of horror, I like to think that Indy finding this well filled with snakes is just the divine filling this hole with whatever will scare the grave robber the most.
Snakes. Why did it have to be snakes?
Actually, many of these snakes are really legless lizards, which have visible ear holes that snakes don't have. When Indy falls in front of the cobra, in the original cut in the VHS release, you could see the cobra's reflection on a pane of glass that they used to separate forward from the snakes. They removed this reflection digitally in the DVD and Blu-ray release, but you can see the snake's reflection on the glass later when Marion is thrown in. Now, while Marion tries to fool Belloc, Tote arrives, and he pulls out what looks like a torture device, but it's just a coat hanger. This apparently is a gag that Spielberg originally shot for his film 1941, and he kept putting it in movies until until it got a laugh. Gotta be honest here, it's just kind of a weird move, but I do like it. Indy and Sala unearth the Ark, and you probably know by now, the Lucasfilm team hid a little C-3PO and R2-D2 Easter egg on the column beside Indy, but when they raise the Ark, it glows with an impossible light source from beneath, giving it its own divine power. The design of the Ark was based on depictions by 19th century French painter James Tissot, a lid with 2 kneeling cherubs with their wings folded over, and it was meant to be carried by poles so that no one would actually touch the Ark. Assistant art director John Fenner's design drawings for the Ark include notes that the sides would depict biblical scenes from the Old Testament. The Nazis take the Ark and toss in Marion. The sound mixing on her shout, "Getting lidded," is so haunting. Now, the snake that drops on Marion was reportedly dropped by Spielberg himself to get a rise out of Karen Allen. Similarly, when she's mobbed by skeletons, some are clearly just shoved up in the actress and getting her in her hair. It's just kind of one of the bummer realities in the way horror was made in the 70s and 80s, whether it was Stanley Kubrick verbally abusing Shelley Duvall on The Shining, or Spielberg and Tobe Hooper on Poltergeist using real human cadavers in the pool and telling JoBeth Williams that they were plastic. It just used to be acceptable to just screw with actors and use the take. Arguably, it still kind of is. But when Marion and Indy escape the tomb by pushing that block out, as they run away, you'll notice the guard is sitting there. I always thought it was because he was sleeping on the job and it was to justify how they were able to get out without anyone stopping them. But actually, this is from a deleted scene where a guard saw what he thought were 2 zombies rising from a tomb and he falls from shock. Now, the pilot of the German plane is a cameo by Frank Marshall, the producer on this film and all Indy films and a husband to Kathleen Kennedy. Spielberg establishes the danger of the propeller early in the fight by having the mechanic's wrench clatter into it. So that way, throughout this fight, we feel how brutal of a death it would be to run into that. The fist fight with the big guy is just awesome to watch. Indy's super outmatched. Meanwhile, everything around it escalates into a game of mousetrap. Marion uses the blocks to knock out the pilot, so that frees up the plane's wheels to roll. When it rolls, the wing bumps into the fuel truck to spill the fuel. Marion shoots at the Nazis, causing a fire that the fuel flows into. The tension rises and rises and rises, leading to this payoff where the Nazi gets chopped up. Actually, as they flee the plane, there seems to be some remains to the right of the plane. Is that his chunks? And another example of great shot composition in the way that you might not think about, the shot of Sala running into frame, the Nazi plane burning in the background, the camera draws back into a tent with Indy and Marion seen only in silhouettes and shadow in the foreground. There's just so much going on in the shot and it looks great. Also notice how Indy wipes his face. He probably had a bit of Nazi blood on it from that spray. The Nazis load the Ark in a truck.
I'm going after that truck. Oh. I don't know. I'm making this up as I go.
I love this line because it reminds us that Indy isn't James Bond, he's just relentless. And so when Indy sets out on horseback, John Williams, Raiders March, trumpet blaring, we saddle up in this movie. We are less than 30 minutes away from the end of the movie here. And I bet that most of us have seen this stretch of the film 3 times more than we've seen the full film. Because when it's Saturday afternoon and this movie shows up on cable, at this moment, we are not gonna be doing anything else for the next half hour. This chase is just a perfectly storyboarded and perfectly edited sequence. Like, look at this shot combination here. Indy stomps on the brake pedal, he and the driver lurch forward in the cab, the truck slows down, the Ark in the back of the truck slides forward and all those Nazis roll around, the drivers in the car behind them react, they rear end the truck, then in the cab the driver regains control and stomps on the gas, causing a loose Nazi in the back flying in the windshield of the car behind. And yes, that's a Wilhelm scream. So throughout all this, we saw action, reaction, decision, and consequence, leading to this payoff. Indy wrestles for control of the truck, and when he's thrown over the hood, he straddles the front wheel. Harrison Ford actually sat in a concealed bicycle seat rigged into the front of the truck. You can see it briefly from the front car when the colonel waves the driver to speed up. Indy climbs beneath the carriage and uses his whip to drag himself behind. So stuntman Glenn Randall himself suggested this stunt. It's just so impressive that you don't mind that the truck is actually not moving that fast. The fact that this guy is getting dragged through dirt and sand and rocks makes this action one of the coolest stunts in any movie, because they actually really did it. These stunts were inspired from one of Spielberg's favorite movies, Stagecoach, directed by his hero John Ford and starring John Wayne, a scene in which a stunt performer, Yakima Canet, leaps from a horse onto another horse and then gets dragged beneath the carriage. So Indy regains the wheel and he drives the truck into this perfectly set up hiding spot. Now some haters over the years have snarked, well wait, how was this all just arranged waiting for him? My friends, this movie already told us.
Meet me at Omar's. Be ready for me.
And on the sign of that garage, it reads Omar's Garage. So this is Sala and Omar just pulling a few favors. In the shot of Belloc and the colonel looking around, the colonel throws a melon at a barking dog and they mixed in a yelp. This gag helps disguise the fact that if you look over in the front seat, that's not Ronald Lacey's coat, it's just his hat slumped on his jacket, because he was not on set on the day to shoot this particular take. So they take a boat, and the Ark hums inside the crate. A ship rat convulses. They actually used a partially deaf rat who already moves his head this unnatural way, but the Nazis commandeer the vessel from one of their U-boats, taking the Ark and taking Marion. You can hear the Germans over the PA, Eins, drei, Acht, which translates to 1138, a nod to George Lucas's film THX 1138. Indy swims over and hangs out on the periscope. There was a deleted scene where the sub was going to dive beneath the water, and Indy was going to use his whip to lasso onto the periscope to drag behind on the water's surface, but Spielberg cut it, because yeah, that would have been crazy. But as the boat approaches the island, they accomplish this shot with a scale model, and you can see a tiny Indy figurine clinging to the periscope, and that's why Indy's so incredibly wet for the next scene. But Indy disguises as a Nazi, and he follows the march inland. As he peels off, you see a fly buzz past camera. There were flies everywhere when they shot on this day, so it wasn't that unusual when this happens.
Your persistence surprises even me. You're gonna give mercenaries a bad name.
Yes, a fly crawls into his mouth! Actor Paul Freeman claimed that he didn't swallow it and that after the take he spit it out and it flew away, but this is happening to all the actors when they shot this. If you look closely, you can see flies crawling over all of their arms and their hands. I like to think of it as an Old Testament plague afflicting these Ark thieves. Belloc calls Indy's bluff to blow up the Ark with an RPG, so why does Indy even pull this foolish move? Well, Indy's making this up as he goes, lay off, but really it was an act of desperation to save Marion. But even after their smooch, his love for history still wins out in this moment. Indy needs to fail here in order for his victory in the following scene to matter, leading us to the big scene. Belloc recites a Hebrew prayer. This is spoken on Sabbath and festival mornings when the Torah Ark is opened. His excerpt translates to, "I do not rely on man, and I do not depend on any angel, but on the God of truth, whose Torah is true. I rely on him, and to his holy and precious name, praises." But Belloc omits the ending of this prayer, the blessing to the Jewish people. Maybe he should have kept it in. The sand falls through the colonel's fingers and then down into Belloc's fingers, recalling the sand running through Indy's fingers back in Peru. Some treasures are just not meant for man to possess. They slip through their fingers. But then, ding dong, God's here. The lights explode and the generator breaks. The first things that happen is man-made light goes away to pave the way for the power of light from God. Ghostly spirits flow through all of them, and the ghost who appears before Belloc was a Lucasfilm receptionist dressed in a white robe and suspended in front of a blue screen, and they composited her face with a skeleton to create this transformation. Fire rises to Belloc's head, and from his eyes, lightning blasts the Nazis. We specifically get a shot of a cameraman, both him and his camera fried. The symbolism of the scene is extremely important. It's staged with floodlights, with Nazis recording it with film cameras, because the Nazis historically filmed everything. They aimed to document the history of their Third Reich. And the fact that in this scene they're filming Belloc's appropriation of a Jewish ritual and the desecration of a Hebrew relic makes this scene a metaphor for the Nazi war crimes of the Jewish people. The violence that follows holds up as a powerful rejection of Nazism. God and the forces of nature wiping clean the Nazi moral corruption from the face of the earth. That's why this scene feels like such a powerful catharsis every time we watch it. God smiting the Nazis via the Ark is adapting passages from the book of Samuel in the Old Testament, which document the Ark's capture by the Philistines, followed by the Philistines suffering a series of plagues. And then the face melting. The colonel's shriveling face was created with a mold of the actor's face lined with bladders filled with the air removed so that it caves in. For Toad's melting face, special effects artist Chris Wallace sculpted a face with several colored layers of gelatin that were melted with propane torches and filmed at slow speed. Belloc's head model was a plaster skull filled with blood bags and other goo that was blown up. They ended up having to conceal it with flames to avoid an R rating. Meanwhile, Indy had told Marion,
"Don't look at it. Shut your eyes, Marion. Don't look at it no matter what happens."
How does Indy know to close their eyes? Well, yes, his academic background, he's got that big book with a buckle, but I like to think after the golden idol's eyes looked at him and cast its own cursed light in Peru, Indy throughout this movie has learned that the only way to survive the wrath of God is to have the reverence not to witness it, to step back from history and humble yourself before the unknown. He has to give up his selfish want to see inside the treasure that was only put in him from macho competition with Belloc, and remember his own academic lecture lessons that he started this movie with. As Indy will learn again in The Last Crusade, only the penitent man shall pass. Now, I'm not trying to convert anyone here, but in Spielberg's Raiders of the Lost Ark, the Hebrew God is real, and any worthy hero must know that at some point in our lives, we must recognize what we don't know and place our faith in some higher cosmic force. This isn't a character surrendering his agency. If anything, it's the hardest choice for a hero in control of his own destiny to make. So back in the US, Indy and Marcus are told that the Ark is being looked at by
top men.
and the crate is wheeled into a desert it'll never be found in, government storage. The most effective man-made security measure of all time is the fortress of American bureaucracy. The greatest treasures in America are just hidden in someone's basement somewhere. It's meant to evoke the ending of Citizen Kane, the idea that one of the most priceless treasures could just end up a piece of junk in a warehouse somewhere. Now, to address the Big Bang Theory argument that Indy might actually be inconsequential to this movie's plot,
and if he weren't in the movie, the Nazis would have still found the Ark, taken it to the island, opened it up, and all died. Just like they did.
this drives me nuts because it's basically what I read in comments from folks who come up with a plot hole that isn't really a plot hole. It's also what annoys me about Sheldon and the Big Bang Theory is these characters are supposedly nerds who overthink everything, but they're written by screenwriters who aren't actually these nerds and don't know how nerds actually talk and watch movies. But anyway, this episode of the Big Bang Theory does go back and forth debating this, but in addition to Indy successfully getting the Ark reburied in government storage, the real issue is Marion and the headpiece. Think about it, Marion was an exile, a barkeep in a remote Nepalese mountain village. The only reason the Nazis could find her is because they followed Indy from San Francisco. Indy could only find her because she was his old flame and he kept tabs on her whereabouts. Without Indy, the Nazis never would have found Marion and they never would have gotten the headpiece. This is why Indy's relationship with Marion is the most important part of this movie. It's the driving force, and it's so satisfying to see him offer his arm to Marion at the end of the movie to let this booze hound drink him under the table. When Indy puts treasure before Marion, he fails, but when he chooses her and lets go of the treasure, he lives. And by living, he gets to avoid becoming history. Support us with an Indy I Love You shirt at nerdriot.shop. Subscribe, turn notifications on, share this channel and its videos with everyone you know. Follow me at Erik Voss. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time, my divers of the deep.